If you move the entire gauge, you turn it and the needle turns, that doesn't mean the needle moved. It means that the whole gauge moved. So that's where we are, NVIDIA. NVIDIA's RTX 4080 is a prime and depressing example in a product stagnation, where it proves once again that it is possible to launch a good product which otherwise saps all momentum and relegates it to meh category. It's a technical word. And sadly, this is because, as we've said for a few GPU launches in the past, several of them, NVIDIA in the last few years actually, for every 1% performance uplift, if you also spend 1% more money, that ruins the part where it's cool. It's no longer cool. It doesn't actually produce a meaningful step for consumers where they feel like the industry or the amount that they get for their money is increasing. CPUs are a fantastic counter to what's happening with the GPU market for NVIDIA at the high end. So if for any reason you doubt, well, but why should we get more than 1% more performance for 1% more money? Look at the CPUs. AMD and Intel have beaten each other bloody for 4 years now to finally get out of the lockstep we were stuck in with Haswell and Skylake and all the other ones that were basically the same. Now with CPUs, you have prices that are relatively fixed. They're like plus or minus $50 each generation, and we still see improvements that are in the double digits. And that's because AMD and Intel have beaten each other up over it. And NVIDIA's out here on the fringes alone, which is on one hand impressive that they were able to get ahead that much, but on the other side, it's causing this problem. And now AMD is trying to catch up with the 7900 XTX, and it might be putting NVIDIA under some pressure, but not just yet. So today we're reviewing the $1,200 RTX 4080 16 gigabyte, the one that's launched, not to be confused with the one that was unlaunched, and it launches tomorrow, the 16 gigabyte that is, and you'll be able to buy it then. So at least you have some time to watch this and find out that it's probably too much money for what you get. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly's contact frame for Intel 12th and 13th gen CPUs. We extensively tested the contact frame previously and found that it helps better distribute pressure across the surface of the IHS. We saw this contribute to a reduction in thermals that could be of benefit to anyone who needs thermal headroom for overclocking, or especially thermal headroom for small form factor PCs. The Thermal Grizzly contact frame is made in Germany with precision machining, and you can learn more about it at the link in the description below. So here's a quick recap of the basics. The 4080 had two flavors originally, 16 gigabyte and 12 gigabyte. 12 gigabyte was unlaunched. NVIDIA basically canceled it and will be bringing it back later with a different name. They already made everything. They're relabeling stuff, hopefully more than just putting a sticker over it. And that's going to come out probably around CES, January sometime, most likely. If it in fact launches, then it's going to have a new name and it will have a new price. We don't know what the price is going to be. We know that the name is probably going to be something like 4070 Ti because they already had a 4070 locked in when they unlaunched the 4080 12 gigabyte. So that's the history of that. The 16 gigabyte still is very much a real card. It's here, we tested it. And to get you up to speed on the specs here, the 4090, that's $1,600 MSRP. The 4080 is $1,200 MSRP. And then the $900 4080 12 gigabyte, again, is a different story we're not covering today. The 4090 runs 24 gigabytes of GDDR6X versus 16 on the 4080 we're reviewing today. The 4090 has 16,384 CUDA cores, and the 4080 has 9,728. That is a massive gap. That is a big enough gap to drive a Ti through. So we wouldn't be surprised if at some point there's a 4080 Ti or 4080 Super or something along those lines. The 4090 has a TDP of 450 watts. The transients actually were pretty good on that, so we did not see the massive transient spikes that we were sort of expecting based on power supply manufacturer rumors before launch, but we already tested that and talked about it in the 4090 review. The 4080 is a 320 watt TDP, and then as for AMD competition, 7900 XTX, 7900 XT are the ones you need to know the names of. Those will be $900 and $1,000, and they launch around a month from now, December 13th. So here's the short version of what you're gonna watch. The gains for the 4080 achieves about 70-ish, plus or minus 5 percentage points of the performance of a 4090, and it does so while being 75% of the price. That's the short version for rasterization. Now let's get into some of the numbers, and then in the conclusion we'll revisit this some more and talk about value for things like the 6000 series and the 30 series as they linger in the market, because they're looking pretty good. We'll look at thermals first. Tested in Port Royal until steady state, we noticed the RTX 4080 FE held a GPU temperature target of 60 degrees Celsius for its average temperature. The hotspot temperature ran about 10 to 15 degrees higher at any given point, maxing out at 75 degrees Celsius. Ambient for this was a fixed 21 to 22 C during testing. This is the same chart except with fan speed added. The RTX 4080 FE follows the same behavior of the 4090, where the left and the right fans spin at slightly different PWM strengths and thus have a different RPM. This is likely to combat undesirable noises. The fan runs at about 40% and 37% consistently when at steady state. Just as a quick reference point, here's how the auto settings on the 4090 and the 4080 FE cards compare. The 4090 FE runs about 2 to 3 dBA higher, which we'll show you in a second, so even with that higher RPM, it's still running warm, and that's expected given the larger core. The 4080 runs, as you see here, about 8 degrees cooler than the 4090 when both are tested with the FE cooler and their default VBIOS temperature target and fan curve. It helps to plot the frequency as well. This lets us know, one, that the card is working properly, and it also provides a reference point for the future, especially if the drivers change this behavior. Here, the card boosts to about 2775 megahertz, and it then stays there basically without any change for the entire test. There are occasional flickers in frequency, but nothing relevant. It's impressively flat here. That's something we saw on the 4090 FE also. Frequency is similar to the 4090, so the biggest difference will be the GPU core itself. Noise levels are the same as the 4090 FE because they use identical fans and coolers. For reference, on this chart, the 4080 FE was defaulting to around 38 to 39 dBA on the marker here, whereas the 4090 FE was closer to 40 dBA. We'll start off with Final Fantasy XIV at 4K. In this one, the RTX 4090 capped at 215 FPS average, with both the new and the old drivers, but we're only showing one of the results because they're the same. That means the RTX 4080's 152 FPS average result has it 71% of the total 4090 performance, and with the $1,200 versus $1,600 MSRP, it's at 75% of the price. It's not very compelling, so this looks like sort of a classic upsell positioning on the 4090 versus the 4080. Framed another way, the 4090 outperforms the 4080 by 41%, while costing 33% more money. Compared to alternatives, the 4080 works wonders to make early 3090 Ti buyers feel bad. It outperforms it by 24% here. The 6950 XT is the next closest. We hadn't actually checked prices for this one in a while, so a quick glance at Newegg revealed a few models at $800, and some with rebates, so they run in the 700s at the cheapest. That's competitive pricing, even against new cards, although there are clear downsides in things like ray tracing performance that we'll look at later. The 6950 XT's 114 FPS average allows the 4080 a 34% lead at 50% more money. The 3090 is around the same performance positioning, or close enough anyway, and generationally and by name only, the 4080 leads the 3080 by 53% with a similar price increase on MSRP. So that's a 1% performance bump for every 1% increase in dollars spent, which is what we call stagnation. We have a history of judging things this way where when we see that one-to-one rise over run for performance to price increase, that's what we define as a product which has not really moved the needle. Now at the ultra high-end flagship category, like say what would typically be a Titan, that's expected behavior, but we also judge those as very poor value. So it makes sense. Once you get into these more gaming class cards, even at $1,200, we do expect to see more than this. And to be impressed, we have to see better than a one-to-one, because otherwise, if you think about it, you're not really gaining anything new as a consumer. It's great. So you can spend more money, you get more performance, and it's in lockstep. Who cares? At 1440p, the 4080 and the 4090 are tied. They're CPU bound. So this test isn't useful beyond showing us where that line is. And of course, CPUs also limit GPU performance, which we've now learned once again. So we'll move on. In Total War Warhammer 3 at 4K, another DX11 title, the 4090 led at 125 FPS average with lows well spaced behind. It's pretty consistent here. The 4080 achieves 70% of that performance once again, landing at 88 FPS average with lows spaced also proportionally. The 3090 Ti gets close to the 4080 here, and as for the 3080, the 4080 leads the last gen namesake by 38%. Moving on to AMD's closest modern competitor until the 7000 series comes out, the 6950 XT flagship is led by 50% by the 4080, so they're pretty far apart, and we're looking forward to seeing where the 7900 XTX lands once it ships, because for now, the 6000 series is clearly being outdone. Pricing is favorable towards AMD's 6950 XT for now, but clearly the performance gap is pretty large here. At 1440p, we still have scaling on the CPU and we can see gaps in performance. The RTX 4090 leads the 4080 FE by 34%, with the 4080 leading the 3080 by 46%. The 6950 XT lands between them, and as for the older hardware, owners of the 2070 would see a 200% increase here. And although we don't have a 2080 in this chart, we do have the 2080 Ti. The 4080 improves 98% over that, and just as a reminder, when the 2080 Ti came out, we said that the pricing was ridiculous. That was a $1,200 card as well. Once again, the price is brutal on this, where we're seeing the same thing, the same 1% performance for every 1% dollar extra spent, and even adjusted for inflation, assuming we checked some random inflation calculator. We're not economists. I don't know what the inflation rate is in the US, but checking against the original launch price and the launch date of the RTX 3080 versus today, the random calculator we found on the internet, which is where all things can be trusted, suggested a 15% inflation. So that would bring us to about a 30% price increase for about a 40-something, 44, 45% performance increase, which isn't a one-to-one, but it's more like 1.5% more performance for every 1% more money spent. And that's better than what we saw in Titans, where you'd get like 2% performance for $400. But in this instance, although it's better than that, it's still just not exciting. NVIDIA needs someone to kick them in the ass a little bit, because they've been alone too long in the market at the high end, and Intel's not anywhere close to that yet. So everybody's kind of looking at AMD going, we need some competition here to keep this in check and keep it exciting for everybody. It would be good for NVIDIA too, because then if they have a stronger launch in the future, stronger value proposition, the reviews go from being, this is a good product, we hate the price, to hopefully this is a good product, awesome price, like we saw with the 3080 and the 1080 Ti, a mistake they'll never make again. 1080p should see some tightening of the ranks, both for architectural reasons on NVIDIA GPUs, where these resolutions particularly benefit AMD, and for CPU reasons. The RTX 4090 now has its lead cut down to 24%, so we're at the limits of what 1080p will allow us to see for scaling and GPUs, although this is still pretty damn good given it's 1080p. The 4080 isn't though, so we can still see how that does versus everything else below it. And that's without a CPU impact here, unlike the 4090. The 4080 leads the 6950 XT by 34% here, then the 3080 below that by 46%, so you can see where the 6950 XT or the 6900X, just like we saw in original testing, they gain ground as the resolution comes down. Following these, the 3070 and the 2080 Ti are about the same, with the 4080 leading those by around 95% or so. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 4K, the RTX 4080 ran at 148 FPS average, with lows at 130 FPS and 127. So those are running tight together, and the frame times are really consistent on these modern cards. The RTX 4090 leads by 35% here, with the 4080 over the 3080 by 50%. The 27 FPS average lead over the 3090 Ti wouldn't be impressive, except the 3090 Ti's original price sort of makes it impressive. Impressively bad pricing for the 3090 Ti at launch, which we already knew. As for AMD, it swings close here, but not close enough to take second place. The 6950 XT allows the 4080 a lead of 29%, but considering the 6950 XT launched at $1,100 and is now $800, it still has price going for it. At 1440p, we're bound by the CPU in this game. The 4090 and the 4080 look the same when, if untethered, they wouldn't be otherwise, as seen in the previous charts. The 4080 leads the 6950 XT by 29% here, so we can see that there's still some scaling that remains constant in this one. The 4080 isn't fully locked up on the CPU like the 4090 is, but it's getting close and it's hitting it sometimes. The lead over the 3080 is 43% here. Rainbow Six Siege is up next, first at 4K. The RTX 4090 ran at 355 FPS average here, with lows spaced strongly at 288 and 265. That has it 32% ahead of the 4080, similar to the 35% lead we saw in Tomb Raider and the 34% lead that we saw in Total Warhammer. they're consistently spaced so far. So that at least renders the decision-making process easier. There's not a lot of different numbers to think about here in terms of performance gaps. The 4080 is 33% ahead of the 3080 here, so not as strong of a lead as we've seen in some of the other tests. The 6950 XT trails the 3080 relatively closely, with the 2080 Ti well below that at 150 FPS average. 1440p gives us comical frames, as Rainbow Six often does. The 4090's 634 FPS average hits a sort of semantic satiation, except for FPS. Like, it's so many frames that the brain stops understanding what we're even talking about anymore. The 634 FPS result leads the 4080 considerably in absolute numbers at a 120 FPS lead, with the percentage reduced down to 24% from the previous 32. We're not at the CPU limit yet, that's around 677 FPS average with our setup, but we're approaching it, and if we inspected this closely, it might be hitting it every now and then. The 4080 leads the 3080 by 31%, posting nearly the same scaling we've seen in previous tests. Even when unbound, it trends down with resolution. The 4080 expands on the 30 series trend of boosting higher FPS with higher resolution. As for the 6950 XT, the 4080 leads that by 23%. It's getting closer as the resolution shrinks. This is also a known trend. Horizon Zero Dawn is next. We don't have as many GPUs tested in this one, but we have enough for a simple chart. The 4090 ran at 165 FPS average here, leading the 4080 by 32%. That's consistent with the previous results, and in raw numbers, it's about a 40 FPS lead. Not life-changing for the amount of money, but then 125 FPS over 100 FPS might not be either, considering the price delta versus the remaining 3080s in inventory and 6950 XTs on shelves today. The 6950 XT does well here, outdoing the 3080 by 16%. 1440p and 1080p were both CPU bound on the 4080, so we'll skip those charts and not even show them. On to the ray tracing tests. These have gotten incredibly complicated to test, GPUs in general, because not only do we have to do rasterization, where we test at 3 resolutions now across all the different games, we don't even publish all the games we test once we start to see a pattern, but you have that plus ray tracing, and then just doing straight ray tracing is not enough either, because we need DLSS or FSR or XESS, any of these super sampling technologies to accompany it, because they also affect the performance and they behave differently for each vendor, where they're not all the same performance uplifts at a fixed like-for-like setting. So for this, we test one game Control without any of the FSR DLSS technologies at all, and then the others we test with those technologies unless otherwise noted. So this kind of gives us a look at both just the raw pure RT performance versus how it does when assisted with technology. We'll start with Control. For this one, we test it raw, no supporting technologies enabled at all. The 4080 ran this at 52 FPS average, allowing the 4090 a lead of 48%. So that's actually a bigger gap than we saw before. We typically were in the 30 to 40% range for the 4090's lead in rasterization. It's disproportionately strong here with RT. Compared to the 3080's 38 FPS average, the 4080 gains about 36% in average FPS. The 6950 XT's 31 FPS average grants the 4080 a 65% lead. Comparatively, that's massive when considering the rasterization gap's far closer range. It's likely that NVIDIA will maintain an RT advantage into the next generation with RDNA 3. Up next at 1440p, the RTX 4090 leads the 4080 by 41%. It's lost some lead compared to 1440p here. That's not because of the CPU bind, but probably just because some of the demand shifts off of being as RT heavy. The 4080 maintains about a 30 FPS lead over the 3080 here, with another 10 FPS on top of that versus the 6950 XT. At 1080p, the gap closes and we lose scaling. They're basically the same now, only 10 FPS apart at the top end, so we'll skip this and move on. Cyberpunk is up next. In Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K with ray tracing enabled, we end up with a very complicated matrix of settings. We're testing with FSR and DLSS in this. However, for both settings, we've tuned to ensure a like-for-like base resolution from which the image is rendered. This allows us to do a fair comparison between them. Here's the chart. The 4090 runs at 79 FPS average under these settings, with the 4080 at 58 FPS average. That's a 37% lead for the 4090, so it's comparable to our previous raster differences. The 4080's lead over the 3080 is a noteworthy 58%, with the 6950 XT allowing the 4080 an advantage of 100%. At 1440p, the 4090 leads the 4080 by 24%, with the 4080 maintaining a large lead over the 3080, now at 65%. 1080p was locked to the CPU, so we'll skip that one. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is interesting with ray tracing because it only has RT shadows, so it's more raster dependent while still leveraging an RT feature. The 4090 leads the 4080 by 37%, back in line with raster results mostly, and the 4080 leads the 3080 by 54%. 6950 XT is led by a similar amount. F1 2022 is our last gaming test, also with ray tracing here. At 4K, the 4090 ran at 84 FPS average, a 50% improvement over the RTX 4080, which itself was 45% ahead of the 3080. Scaling has now firmly established a pattern, so we can stop with the gaming benchmarks as we're not seeing much deviation. Time for the last chart, power testing. For this, we're doing a simple full workload in firmark. This is easy to benchmark for GPUs because it's predictable and it pins GPUs at maximum power consumption permitted through vBIOS. It's also fair because it's the same on every card we test. The RTX 4080 FE pulled 316 watts when stock, measured at the PCIe cables and at the slot, with the overclock increasing that to 343 watts. The stock numbers are effectively the same as the 3080, so at least in this regard, NVIDIA's efficiency, or its performance per watt, has actually generationally improved. They've done better here. The power is also far reduced from the RTX 4090, which ran at 496 watts when stock in the same test. For reference, the 6950 XT we mentioned earlier was at 377 watts. Concluding then, so to quickly recap some of the numbers we ran through earlier, we were seeing, again, it's about 70 to 75% of the performance of a 4090 at 75% of the price. You could look at it another way, where the 4090 leads anywhere from 30% to 40% on average, except when CPU constrained, where obviously it just drops depending on whatever that constraint is. In games like Final Fantasy, we saw a 4080 lead over the 6950 XT at 4K of about 34%. It led the 3080 by 53%. And then Total War 4K, just as another example, the 4080 led the 3080 by 38%. It led the 6950 XT by 50%. Rainbow Six 4K had the 4080 leading 33% over the 3080, 4090 leading 32% over the 4080. And then with ray tracing benchmarks, we saw a far larger gap form in some tests that are more RT reliant, whereas the games like Tomb Raider, where it's just one RT feature and otherwise all rasterization, those basically resembled the rasterization testing. So as for where that leaves us today, well, first of all, this is pretty disappointing. 1200, it's like, it feels like we're kind of back to where we were with launches between 2020 and now. Between the 3080 launch, it was actually great. I mean, price performance was there. They brought it down from the 20 series. So maybe some of that was maybe a little bit of Stockholm syndrome there with the 20 series, where 2080 Ti came out $1,200, much like this is now, although the time's different, obviously. But the 3080 felt like a pretty solid launch, and the MSRP was the reason for that, where it was kind of like a call back to the 1080 Ti. 1080 Ti is, as a reminder, different time, inflation differences too, but $700, and regardless of inflation or economics or any of that, when it launched, it was a great thing for performance and value, and that maintained true for at least a couple generations. The thing is still holding on well. So the 3080 felt like a good call back to something that people associated positive feelings towards, the 1080 Ti. And we lost that with the 4090, clearly, because it's more of a Titan class card. You never expect those to be received well from a value perspective. The 4080 had a chance to sort of get people back interested in NVIDIA's new stuff from a value proposition, which is the most important angle to hold, but it's not there. And you know, NVIDIA's CEO can get up on stage and talk about how low prices are, or dropping prices are a thing of the past as much as he wants. At the end of the day, his own product is killing his current products for value. So if you don't need the newest thing, for some people, you feel bad if you buy something a generation old because, well, you're buying a 2022 model and it's about to be 2023. You're buying a 2020 model and it's 2022. Realistically, though, it doesn't actually matter if the product you're looking at achieves what you want. And right now, the cards are all so ridiculously high in performance that if you take a step back and you look at those charts, just remember that if you're looking at something where it's like GN had to invest actual effort to create a GPU bottleneck, probably for your purposes, a 3080 versus a 4090, you're going to get better value out of the older thing, even though it's technically a little older. So as long as you're okay with that, and as long as you're okay with throwing away a little bit of future-proofing because it's not the newest absolute thing right now, you can put that money towards something else, maybe future-proof elsewhere instead, or just save it for the next GPU purchase. So anyway, all that to say, right now, the 6950 XT is actually, we hadn't looked at the price until this review. It's in the 700s now, 800-ish as sort of a floor, just quick glance at Newegg. And that's a pretty interesting price positioning. The 3080, not too far off from that. The 4080 is just not it for us. The value is not there. And it's sad because it's actually a pretty good product just in terms of performance alone, as is the 4090. They've done well with the engineering. It's actually impressive how much the 4090 lifted up from last generation. And we expect the 4090 to be expensive. There's got to be some give here, though, somewhere for the enthusiast market. And $1,200 for this is just not. We're stuck in one-to-one rise over run for price performance, and that is how we define stagnation. And if you think about it for more than a second, it should be pretty obvious why, because the needle has not moved if you're moving everything with it. If you move the entire gauge, you turn it, and the needle turns, that doesn't mean the needle moved. It means that the whole gauge moved. So that's where we are, NVIDIA. Hopefully AMD kicks them a little bit in the ass to be more competitive here on pricing, but that's all we got for you on this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. We'll have some follow-ups, I'm sure. And you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus. Once again, we'll be looking at partner models, I'm sure, just because it is a good product at a performance level, but we can't recommend it right now today. We'd say wait a little bit and see what happens. So we'll see you all next time.